I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are looking at a poem by Bai Juyi. Have we done any Bai Juyi poems?
When I sent you this, I wondered, I don't think we've done any Bai Juyi, which is really interesting because Li Bai and Du Fu are the sort of go-to names in the Tang Dynasty. You could make a case for Bai Juyi being the most popular during his day.
He's certainly very prolific. I think he's written, I want to say like 3,000 poems that we still have today, I believe.
And very, very popular. He started writing poetry at the age of 12, and it's partly thanks to poetry that he even got involved in government service, because when he went to Chang'an early in his life, he handed some of his poetry off to an official there, and the official went, "Whoa, this is great. You should get involved here."
But that's kind of the classic story of everybody in the Tang Dynasty who's anybody, right? Like poetry was the way that you got ahead.
So he published his Song of Everlasting Sorrow, which is still popular today. It was very popular when it was published in 806. Bai Juyi's career is kind of old in that he's a maverick, a little bit like Li Bai, in the sense that he never really felt it necessary to obey all the rules. So he gets involved in government service, hooray, which is sort of everyone's dream. Shortly after he starts as an archivist with Yuan Zhen, who was another poet at the time, he wrote another poem called On Stopping the War, which was a criticism of some of the officials who were above him. He was exiled for impiety and various other things. If you write a poem called On Stopping the War and you criticize people who are literally still alive and above you in the bureaucracy, it's not going to go well. Through this and through some later poems, he gains a reputation as sort of a poet of the people. He takes a job as a government secretary, and when he actually starts getting some power, he transforms us. In a little way, we have another podcast, a couple of podcasts actually on Wang Anshi. He's a little bit like that, only unlike Wang Anshi, he lasts a little longer and actually has a more practical impact. When he was governor of Hangzhou in 822, for example, the farmers around the area had a water supply that was messed up. The dike had collapsed. Bai saw that the people were really suffering because the dike wasn't working, so he had it, I forget with exact how many government funds, but has it rebuilt. But towards the end of his life, a little bit like Tao Yuanming, he sort of retires to the country, seclusion. And I have to say this because I just caught myself sounding like this. Dear listeners, I have a cold, so if I sound particularly nasal, I apologize. Bai Juyi's poetry does not sound nasal, so just reflect on that instead.
There was a bit more nasally sound in terms of Tang Dynasty versions of Chinese compared with modern-day Mandarin. I mean, if you think about like Taiwanese and Cantonese, that's much closer to the sound of Tang Dynasty poetry than modern-day Mandarin. So maybe it makes sense that you have a cold.
Maybe the fact that I'm nasal is sort of a stroke of fate. It's meant to remind you that Bai Juyi sounded very nasally. Anyway, so his poetry, this is sort of his career, right? He goes into government service. He does some great things for people. He makes a lot of other people very angry, as you do when you take the side of the people beneath you as opposed to the people above you. He did write, as Lee mentioned, over 3,000 poems. That's a lot of poems, especially when you consider how hard it was to write.
I don't think you've even written that many poems.
You never read my poems. Actually, it's been a long time since I've written any poetry.
Thank goodness.
Well, you have never read my poetry. Don't say that if you haven't read my poetry. Maybe I'm amazing. Maybe I'm sitting on a box full of genius like Emily Dickinson, and no one will know until I die, and they open it up and go, "Whoa."
I know Emily Dickinson, Rob, and you're no Emily Dickinson.
Says the man who's never read a word of my poetry. It's like my kids when they say they hate something to eat, and you're like, "You've never even had this. How do you know?" I just do. Anyway, wow, that was way off topic. Anyway, back to Bai Juyi. So Bai Juyi's poetry also in it. So that's his life, right? So he has the sort of secluded, contemplative Bai Juyi, the public service Bai Juyi, and his poetry matches that. He's got poems that are deeply moody, deeply reflective, and kind of hard to place in public service. Then he's got others that are the complete opposite, that are not even particularly contemplative, just like, yeah, this guy's life sucks, thanks to the government, stuff like that.
So I should point out, Bai Juyi was born in 772 and died in 846, so he's coming I see references to him as being a middle Tang poet, but I think of him as more of a late Tang poet because he's born after the Anlushan Rebellion. He's coming after the greats, Du Fu and Li Bai, have already kind of done their thing. And I don't know if he actually, Rob, do you know, did he know either Li Bai or Du Fu?
I don't have any idea.
Anyways, he's coming after them. He's sort of, it almost seems like he's kind of combining their two modes of poetry. Du Fu is very much the kind of bureaucratic poet, the poet of the state, the poet of history. Li Bai is the sort of Taoist, drinking and writing poetry in a boat, praising the moon, this kind of almost sort of Zhuangzian mode of poetry. For me, Bai Juyi is kind of both of them combined.
It's a good way to think of it. Yeah, I do know that one of the reasons he was so popular is that his style was a little different than others. It was much more approachable. At least that's the way we understand it from how it was written. And if you read some of his more sort of socially conscious poetry, that obviously makes sense. The poem that we're talking about today is one of his more contemplative ones. I'm using David Hinton's translation in classical Chinese poetry just for reference sake. If you listen to the poem, you're like, dude, I want to read more of that. Well, that's the translation we're using.
Sorry, that's the book, Classical Chinese Poetry,
right.
Which
yes, thank you.
David Hinton.
David Hinton didn't translate all of classical Chinese poetry. The poem is called Autumn Thoughts Sent Far Away, and I'm just going to read it real quick, and then we can dive into it. We share all these disappointments of failing, autumn 1,000 miles apart. This is where autumn wind easily plunders courtyard trees. But the sorrows of distance never scatter away. Swallow shadows shake out homeward wings. Orchid scents, thin, drifting from old thickets. These lovely seasons and fragrant years falling lonely away. We share such emptiness here.
Rob, is this a love poem?
Good question. What do you think?
I don't think it is, but I'm not sure. Seasonal poetry is very popular in classical Chinese poetry. And this word si, the thoughts in autumn thoughts, is oftentimes, it has this kind of romantic notion, or at the very least, it's a sort of longing for a person who you've been separated from. But I can't make heads or tails of this poem. Is it about him missing a lover, or is it just about the season and kind of an observation on how the changing of the season, how the coming of fall, I'm going to use the word, Rob, I know you hate it, a symbolic meditation on the aging and passing of all human life?
See, I don't have a problem with that form of symbolically. It's when we get into, like, what is the leaf, Lee? Well, the leaf clearly is desire or something and not a leaf. But I think you're right here. I think this is at least, if not symbolic, at least referential. It's gesturing towards something bigger than just, hey, someone's left, I'm sad. For one thing, the time span is a lot bigger. Usually in these seasonal poems where someone is missing someone, it's in a particular season. This is, first of all, very far, 1,000 miles apart. The last two lines, the last stanza says, these lovely seasons and fragrant years falling lonely away. We share such emptiness here. So first of all, a lot of time is passing in the poem. And second, he's sharing this with someone. We share such emptiness here. And I love that last line because it's a really strange thing to think about, sharing emptiness. Usually when you share, you're not
you have
empty,
something.
right?
It's not abstract like that. And he says, we are separated by 1,000 miles. We share all these disappointments of failing autumn 1,000 miles apart.
Yeah, and it does say that they're 1,000 miles apart, but at the end it says we share such emptiness here. There's a kind of disconnect happening here. Is there a disconnect in time? Like, does the poem start with him being far away and end close up? Is he writing about the fact that even near or far, it doesn't matter where we are, there's still just a lot of emptiness here? He doesn't leave you with a lot of concrete stuff here.
There's something kind of haiku-like about.
Yeah, very definitely.
It's unclear on what he's referencing. There's this evocation of the season, which is an important part of the haiku, but it's just so ambiguous, and there's so much kind of boiled down into such a short piece of work. Bai Juyi was very popular in Japan, very popular.
Yes, Basho, the great haiku writer, references him, actually directly quotes him in one or two poems.
Definitely seems like we've got a little bit of a kind of, you can see the origins of the haiku here in Bai Juyi's poetry.
What I think is really valuable about this poem, but quite apart from the fact that it's just a really nice poem, is how it works when set alongside his more socially conscious poetry. Because it's easy to see a disconnect, like when he's writing about how the people are getting ripped off by the government, there's not a lot of confusion about what's going on. Everybody knows what's going on. It's more like a narrative. The fact that both were popular, that the people appreciated both, suggests a depth of social consciousness that you don't usually see. It's a poet going, yes, we should pay attention to the fact that these people are getting ripped off by the government. But the people that are getting ripped off by the government are also people who appreciate things like autumn thoughts, a general feeling of emptiness when autumn comes. Everyone can identify with this. He's not content to just write about one thing. Both things have to be included.
Rob, you were the one who selected this poem. What struck you most about this poem? We've talked about kind of whether or not it's a love poem, the sort of reference to nature, whether or not it's a meditation on human death. What reached out to you when you chose this poem?
Well, first of it is the haiku quality. You mentioned the haiku sort of quality. There is something very peaceful and meditative about it that I like, but I also love poems that you finish that are striking, but then when you reflect on it, you really are not entirely sure why, and you're also not entirely sure what just happened. We've got a series coming up on Lu Xun, but in Lu Xun's best pieces, there's some of this too. You read it and you go, wow, wait, what? And that's what happens in this poem. You read it to the end and you read a line like, these lovely seasons and fragrant years falling lonely away. We share such emptiness here. You go, oh, that's nice. And you think, wait, share emptiness? What?
Is it nice, Rob? Is it nice? Is this meant to be a happy ending? Is that how you're...
I truly don't know. I truly don't know. See, that's what I love about that last line. You would think emptiness is a really negative thing. But Bai Juyi was deeply influenced by Chan Buddhism. So to an extent, right, I know, dun dun, I was saving that for the very end, right? Surprise ending. You don't get a lot of surprise endings when you talk about poetry, but here you do, my friends.
Honestly, it would have been better for you not to have told us, because that way we would have not had anything, and then we would have had all knowing. That's the very a Buddhist kind of way of doing it, wouldn't it? Like,
God,
by not telling
right.
you told us.
I should probably edit that out and just leave you with the emptiness. So there you can read it the Buddhist way. Sharing such emptiness could be a kind of peace, a kind of settling, or it could be emptiness the way we think of it. But the fact that you're sharing it perhaps makes it less empty. As you mentioned, a seasonal poem. When you read it, it's a Tang Dynasty poem, autumn thoughts, sent far away. You're like, oh, I get it. This is going to be about his lover's gone or whatever, and they're really sad, wish he were here. Instead, it almost sounds like the poet is okay with things the way they are. Empty, yes, but there's something connecting that makes the emptiness okay.
I sit in silence, Rob, at your genius, and also because I think silence is the only way to respond to a poem like this, this sort of kind of Buddhist haiku or proto-haiku. Rob, it's autumn now, and you and I are more than 1,000 miles away. I hope you experience this lovely season and the fragrant years falling lonely away, and we can share this emptiness together on 2 separate continents. And on that note, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.